I want to thank all three of you for three splendid and interesting and thoughtful papers, and I'm particularly interested in the way they reflect various aspects of George Mosse's work, which of course we're all doing all the time here. I first want to reflect on Udi Greenberg's paper on Ecumenism and Nazism, partly the critical remarks I want to make are meant to be helpful to what you've said. They're not meant in any kind of a negative way. The overall project Udi adumbrates is concerned with the genealogy of ecumenism in Europe. But in this paper, he confines himself to Germany and Nazism. It would be interesting to explore the position of Germany in the broader European context. There had been earlier ecumenical impulses in Europe, such as the 1910 World Missionary Conference, and other key figures such as the Swedish Lutheran Nathan Söderblom, Archbishop of Uppsala, whose activity in the life and work movement brought his recognition in 1930 with the Nobel Peace Prize. Also, when one thinks of the different ecumenical movements inside Germany itself, how would you fit in someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was also very, very much concerned with ecumenism? Also, it seems to me then that when one comes after the war, to the key moment of Vatican II and the Protestant World Council of Churches' double declarations in the 1960s of each other as brethren in the faith, it seems to me that you can't ignore impulses from the extra-European Christianity as well, and for England and France and so forth and so on. So I'd be very interested in exactly what kind of play you can give to the German impulses and the German theology. What I find most fascinating in this paper is the thesis of the conflation of dogma and political ideology among the various confessional groups, and then the consequent recognition of other religious groups, not through dogmatic change, but through ideological commitments. Seems to me that something like that is going on in the United States between conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals around various political projects or ideological projects. I want to explore one moment in the paper, however, that I find intriguing, and that's the issues of liberalism, the thesis of liberalization of churches, because I find the problem or the concept of liberal as too unanchored in the text. Liberalism takes two forms at least, one theological and one ideological. And I'd like to know how these two aspects were interrelated over time. There's a whole long tradition of liberal theology growing in the 19th century, and then there's the problem of secular liberalization, and the interplay between the two seems to me to be important. Already in 1841, the future Cardinal John Henry Newman, 4 years before his conversion, wrote that, quote, "The most serious thinkers of us are used to regard the spirit of liberalism as the characteristic of the Antichrist." For the most part, Greenberg associates liberalism or liberalization with the spirit of tolerance or the notion of equality rooted in some form of individualism. And he sees the roots of the ecumenical movement as profoundly anti-liberal, exclusionary, border marking. Now that seems to be targeting ideological liberalism, parliamentary democracy, modern forms of individualism. Here, a broader treatment and a greater definition of liberalism would be interesting to pursue. But it does seem to me that there are also very important issues of theological liberalism. Here, the long 19th century tradition of biblical criticism, debates on the nature of the Trinity, the figure of Christ, huge debates over the notion of the virgin birth, for example, the nature and importance of the sacraments. And it's how do these two forms track with each other? Now, it's precisely the development of theological liberalism, which some, in the United States at least, during the 50s and 60s, associated with the World Council of Churches, for example, that provoked the rise of fundamentalism in the United States at least, with its problematic relationship to big tent Christianity and insistence on personal conversion. Now, Stefanie's paper, Sex and Violence, Race Defilement in Weimar and Nazi Germany. Stefanie sets up the problem of explaining a peculiarly odious form of violence against elderly Jewish women in 1942 by middle-class, middle-aged police officers. None of the going explanations for the violence of groups of men seem to work. So she goes back to read together anti-Semitism, gender, and emotion, much in the spirit of earlier work by George. I want to pick up on some of her ideas and pursue an additional line of inquiry based on her approach. She points, for example, to what she calls pornographic anti-Semitism from such publications as Der Stürmer, eagerly read by teenagers, and also rituals then of humiliation, predominantly against Jewish men, and of course popularized images of Jewish men as Rassenschänder. But the text Stefanie dwells upon and deals with, that text deals with attacks on elderly women, not men. And I want to suggest an idea that follows out that particular sexual gender scenario. She notes that the people attacked were so much like the parents of the middle-aged police officers. But it was less a question of parents than one of mothers, it seems to me. Although I think of myself as just entering middle age, I imagine that Stefanie's middle-aged police officers were somewhere between 45 and 55. That means that they had taken part in the war. It may well be that, as Dorothee Vierling in her account of a family during World War I has suggested, it was much more mothers than fathers who sent their sons off to war, possibly a wellspring of resentment. It seems to me that's a very interesting topic or a problem for a PhD, to look at mothers and warriors during World War I. Probably already done. I also find Tavelites' account of cultural aggression against mothers during the 20s useful to think about. He wants to underline the significance of mothers to grasp society's murderous nature and to highlight the maternal influences on sons of all classes, on sons who were later only too eager to insert themselves into the deadly macro machines of fascism. Both his and Stefanie's analyses see the tension between aversion and attraction as one of the mechanisms for generating violence. From the late 19th century onwards, it was commonplace to associate motherhood with sexuality, with pansexuality. I could cite Otto Weininger as a scurrilous example, but what was at issue across so many novels, treatises on anatomy and medical advice books, cell theory, go right through all the medical literature, was a sense of the unboundedness of the female and her capacity to fuse, merge, or dissolve itself or herself into another. And these metaphors often were meant to convey a sense of aggression, either on the part of the mother or as a pathological reaction of ill-adjusted or violent sons. The all-sexual mother who elicited and interrupted incestuous desires and in turn became the object of aggression went well beyond German fascist culture. One example, D.H. Lawrence, who thought that it was through the evocation of sexual desire that mothers exercised power over their sons. It haunts and terrifies a man, he wrote. And when you look at the passages, his passages are violent language. To sum up, I would suggest that Stefanie's approach might fruitfully be brought to bear on issues of gender sexuality, the female as mother, and parenthetically, von Braun is here in the audience, has written on this. Parenthetically, given the incestuous feel to the issue, note that the original German word for incest, Blutschande, was repurposed to stigmatize miscegenation. It's also done in the U.S. The point to make is that it is perhaps the latent feelings that could only be acted out aggressively against a group for which there would be no consequences. Robert Zwarg, there's nothing innocuous left, the problem of the everyday. Robert's tool is to open up his site for our discussion, or his tool for opening up his site for our discussion is everyday life. His thesis is that everyday life was erased under the Nazis, and that erasure is given the lie by the surface civility in his post-war pictures of the hospital that once was gifted and supported by Rudolf Mosse. I have three reactions to this approach to everyday life. First, the use of Adorno and a string of intellectuals. Adorno in particular had no use for, no understanding for, or interest in popular culture. And I'm skeptical of Adorno's curious defense of the intellectual's isolation, together with his defense of no collaboration, no social mixing or participation. Here I think that Mosse is the much better guide. He wrote in The Crisis of German Ideology, written 2 years before Nazi culture, and the text on which the latter was constructed, and this I quote him at length, "It would have been simpler to write a book such as this in the heat of moral indignation. However, such an emotion might not only have obscured a serious historical analysis, but what is worse, it might have given the impression that the ideas treated here were an aberration, something abnormal, and indeed satanic. Yet the important fact to bear in mind is that many of the men and women who came to hold these ideas were normal in any usual definition, people whom one might have considered good neighbors." The second is with the conceptualization. I might parenthetically say, in all of the seminars I took with George, every time we took the high horse and some kind of moral attack on whoever we were writing about and so forth, he would always stop us and get us to think about practical everyday life and how people have to live everyday practical lives. And it was a very interesting time to always test your own sense of moral outrage against George's much cooler approach. The second thing about everyday life is with the conception of everyday life as harmless. And these are words, again, from your paper. Harmless, innocent, silly, happy, relaxed, innocuous, unpolitical, shallow, glossed by the word normalcy. It seems to me that the category of everyday life, set up this way, loses its critical possibilities. I think of de Certeau in The Practice of Everyday Life, where he characterizes everyday life as a set of tactical practices working often against the strategic structures of states, architects, merchants, and ideologues. Or the late and lamented Alf Lütke, who in writing about the possibilities of everyday life for workers in Germany after 1936 suggests the possible and the negotiable, characterizing the space for workers' action, for example, by what he called and made famous Eigensinn. Third, and briefly, how long does a space or a practice evoke a particular moral response? Pictures from 1951, viewed then, viewed now. How does time passing affect the issue? Remember that the 30 Years' War, as a proportion of the population, led to more deaths than all of World War I and World War II together. And how is one to recognize the times in which one lives? Brecht claimed that he lived in dark times. Do we live in dark times? Are there ever non-dark times? George Mosse always thought that life's realities possess powerful demands on people, and finding an ethical balance was crucial for living a moral life. He found unsatisfactory both a life of unexamined power and the life of the virgin moralist, unsullied by immersion in practical affairs. I think there was always a didactic element in Mosse's work and his approach to texts. In his approach to texts, he always teased out the tensions in a particular context. And that's closely related to his pedagogical intent, which I want to emphasize was always a running commentary on the possibilities in a particular situation for meaningful, effective, and above all, moral action. But what drives the analysis is the location of tensions between practical life and ethical values. To quote him at length, we must realize the dangers inherent in idealism that stresses the purity of absolute values and is apt to retreat into its own circumscribed world in the face of a reality that will not bend to the intellectual's desire. Mosse found fault with those intellectuals who failed, and I quote him, to make meaningful contact with popular culture. And then in an early work on Puritan intellectuals, the book The Holy Pretense, when we were doing his Festschrift, he handed me a copy of The Holy Pretense, and he'd written on it, "This is my most important work, but nobody else agrees." And here the image he has is between the serpent and the dove, the evil and the opposite of evil, and the question of balance. And I quote him from that work. This early work on Puritan intellectuals, negotiating between their faith and the realities of reason of state. He wrote, "Thinking themselves surrounded by enemies on every side, the divines had to come to terms with that fact of life which Machiavelli described in his axiom that a man who wants to do good must perish among so many men who are evil. The problem involved is to keep a balance between the serpent and the dove so that neither obliterates the other." Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I understand that we have 6 minutes to answer those. Are we going to ask questions from the audience, or should we respond to you?
I think this is.
Mine isn't a long question, and perhaps it's, well, first I want to thank you, David, and the panelists, Udi, Robert, and Stefanie. Stefanie, my question or thought is, or maybe it begins with a comment, your discussion, your presentation reminded me right away of the works of Otto Dix and George Gross.
Can you take that away from your lips because it's just bounced?
Oh, all right. Your presentation reminded me of the works of Otto Dix and George Gross. I think of the paintings in Stuttgart, the large canvases of the Großstadt, the metropolis, and the Ungleiches Liebespaar, sprechende von sex and violence, and also the Drei Weiber, and of course the sex murders of George Gross. I see these works, or these works, as historical documents in paint on canvas. Would they be of value in illustrating your work? That's my question.
Good. I'm going to ask.
What would be your thoughts?
I'm going to ask for several questions and then let the panel answer them serially. There's somebody over here and somebody here. If you can bring the.
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating panel. I have some very short questions for Udi. This is very new and very interesting. I just wondered, you do say that ideological questions were more important than the theological basics, but how do they reconcile the protagonists of these movements or these groups? How do they reconcile with questions that were dividing between Protestants and Catholics, such as thinking of the Eucharist, for example. Were they addressing them? Were they maybe postponing them or just ignoring these questions? And then more speaking, focusing on Catholics, how did they face or approach the dilemma of the more internationalism of Catholicism, like their loyalty to Rome or to other churches, not necessarily Protestants? And then this is a bit more looking at the broader context. How did they, after the war, dissolve, like the protagonists of these movements, dissolve in a German society that would some very few decades later be among the driving forces of at least Catholic reform and more progressive movements in German society until today, where German Catholicism has sort of problems to integrate in the larger Catholicism?
I have two questions. One for you, Frau Schüler. Do you think that the education program from Hitler has as consequence that absence of affection, emotion, and supply of affect and attention in childhood can be the effect in the violence and disturbing on sexuality that we have in the Second War and the phase after it until now? And about the discussion of religions, the last time of ecumenism, it was, on my opinion, political, and because theological, you cannot accept that Nazism and Holocaust would be happened in the way that the religion tells and that the religion is. Do you think that the dialogue between both dialogue between evangelical, Protestant, and Catholics, in order to put as an excuse for the political background, is the way they manipulated for the Holocaust, or not? It's
We have time for one more question, and then we'll leave it over to the panel.
Oh, we have to exit the room?
We have to stop. Okay. Let you guys say a few words.
Okay, so let's say very quickly. To your question about were there ecumenicals before? Yes, there were, but what I find interesting, the movement that you talked about, the Ecumenical Missionary Conference, that and Zoderblumen Ecumenical Movement, was a movement to unify all Protestant churches together and to bring all missionary Protestant missions and Protestant churches together. One thing that is absolutely erased from the history of this is that they were all anti-Catholic. And one of the main motors behind it, at least in the ideological level, to justify those kind of unification efforts, was that it would be to fight Rome and fight Catholics. And what I was finding interesting is that it is this movement that then in the 50s and 60s dramatically changes its mind, becomes vanguard in a force for peace with Catholics. So in many ways, the existence of ecumenical movements earlier is actually makes the question even more potent of trying to understand how is it then that the most fierce anti-Catholics are those who then become supporters of ecumenism as we understand it later. To the question about how they handled theological questions, the most important theological questions were postponed. For example, the Eucharist, it was just decided to not discuss until later, or minimized in order to argue that the similarities is much more profound. And the only way to understand it, in my view, is not theological, but what are the political calculations behind it. Nazism is part of the story. There's also the Cold War and decolonization and the place of churches in public sphere after the collapse of Christian majority empires. But it is always tied to the very practical political project that is around, and the theology is much to this, as far as I can understand, is the secondary importance to it. To the question about what is the role of, I'm not a practicing Christian. I'm not Christian at all. I don't approach it from the point of view of asking what is manipulation of religion, what is religion. This is a question that to me is not something I'm equipped or interested in answering. I'm interested in how people who see themselves as practicing Christian understand what it means to be in this ideological project. And in that, the Holocaust is absolutely secondary. There's zero discussion of the Holocaust in ecumenical literature. Most of the important breakthrough happens long before the Holocaust and before the war. And it continues after. So I don't think that, to your question, I don't see ecumenism as a way to justify the Holocaust, as a way to just, it's not on the radar at all in some ways.
Yes, thank you very much. And to your question about the long-term impact of Nazi education, I think that's another lecture. I would recommend the book by Dagmar Herzog, who wrote on this, and just a very short answer would be that apparently National Socialism had for so-called Aryans was quite permissive, and in the BDM and Hitlerjugend groups they had quite a more libertarian attitude towards sexuality, which later on made people remember this time as something very positive. But I think this will lead us now until 6 p.m. if we continue. So I would just thank you very much for the art remark, for Otto Dix and George Gross. I have to look at it. I will follow. I will go for this. And one more last thank you to David for mentioning the mother as an idea, which is amazing. That's being a mother myself. It never occurred to me, but maybe not by chance. So I will have to think about it. Thank you.
See if there's any resentment there. Anyway, thank you very much for all your work on this panel, and